Thank you, Sarkis, for the presentation. So let me take a cue from what you've said and maybe put it in a different perspective, particularly about the de-risking as a word. And I think it's a misnomer, really. Not that I agree with what the governors and the regulators have said in the US, but just from a different perspective, because a lot has been said about de-risking. Everyone's involved in it. The World Bank and IFC and FATF have gotten involved and have written papers on it.
IMF.
To fight an IMF and to fight de-risking. There's so many conferences and seminars that you'd feel things should move, but things are not moving. Things are actually getting worse. Countries continue to be de-risked. Banks continue to be shut out from the regulated system, and populations continue to be left out and forced to go underground into the unregulated system, into the parallel markets. And so I think, and afterwards we can talk about it with Josan, that it's easy for the correspondent banks to say this is de-risking. De-risking is an acceptable term. Who doesn't want to reduce risk? Who doesn't want to de-risk? But it's not really de-risking, and it's not really due to risk. It's not really due either to the penalties and fees and sanctions that have been applied on the banks. And in fact, to stress the point that this is not de-risking, it's maybe demarketing or exiting markets or closing or stopping sales of correspondent banking activities. Between 2008, the financial crisis, and up to the end of last year, the US regulators imposed approximately $200 billion of fees and sanctions and penalties on major banks. Now, out of those $200 billion of sanctions, I think this year we can add a few billion again to a couple of banks. And that's a study done by Washington-based US think tank, an institute. The 200 billion were dished out to approximately 30 banks in 150 different cases. But of those, only approximately $20 billion, that's really less than 10% of the total, were due to sanctions or non-compliance with sanctions or evading sanctions. Basically, two main headlines. The first one, violation of rules prohibiting business with enemy countries. The second one is inadequate money laundering controls, respectively 15 billion and 2 billion for those two main titles. And those were given to 10 banks approximately, 3 of which took the major share, the bulk of that share. And so you have all the correspondent banks in the world reacting to 200 billion of fines, 20 billion of which only were for compliance and KYC and AML reasons. 3 banks in the world paid the biggest bulk of those fees and sanctions. And in fact, correspondent banks are exiting correspondent banking for 20 billion in fees, but I haven't seen major international banks exiting the toxic securities market, manipulation of interest rates, or the foreign exchange market, or credit card abuses, and closing these activities because it cost them 150, 160, 200 billion dollars. And so really let's go back and put things into perspective and see what is causing this de-risking activity. And is it really because of respondent banks? Is it really because of us doing something, maybe slipping bad transactions through our correspondent banks, giving them bad information, giving them bad names, or giving them transactions for bad clients that are working with them? And from most of my conversations with both banks that have been on the de-risk side or banks that have been doing de-risking, all of them admit that it's not due to actions on our behalf, actions that respondent banks have done, or bad transactions that have slipped through the correspondent banking system. And so I ask, why is this such an overreaction from the part of correspondent banks, and why these correspondent banks, these international major correspondent banks that we deal with on a daily basis, which is their bread and butter business to do correspondent banking, have overreacted so much, have gone overboard in, well, closing relationships and closing accounts and exiting markets and really pushing whole countries outside of the banking system. And in fact, a lot of the evidence points to the fact that correspondent banks themselves, at some point, took a conscious decision to knowingly allow some bad transactions through or some bad actors in their system. Often, they also try to skirt the rules by their own definitions. Or maybe they had a mistaken interpretation of some of the rules. And I understand that's difficult. It's always difficult to interpret the rules. It's always difficult to interpret the regulations and the differences between US regulations and European regulations, which come like in 500 pages of documents. But again, it's also a misinterpretation of certain issues. It's not the fault until now on the regulators, although I'll come to that later. Or maybe the correspondent banks themselves fell victim at some point to rogue clients, rogue actors and activities, but really not victims to respondent bank actions. And so nothing points to efforts by respondent banks, by us, to make headaches to the correspondent banks or to put them in trouble with their own regulators. So my answer to the first question is correspondent banks have really taken dramatic actions, not because of actions by respondent banks, but because they made mistakes, or maybe sometimes consciously made these mistakes. So what's the consequence? Well, we've talked about them a lot. The governor talked about them, the vice governor talked about them, we all talked about them. Bad actors who were underground are still underground, but now are even less regulated and less supervised and less monitored. Good actors, good clients are moving underground because they can't bank through the normal financial system anymore. And so financial exclusion is increasing, a topic dear to your heart, Najib. And humanitarian aid has suffered, so it's difficult to get humanitarian aid back and forth and make the necessary transfer. So are we facing a redefinition of correspondent banking activities and transaction banking? Or are correspondent banks putting up new, almost impossible cost-benefit scenarios on the revenue side to justify what they're calling de-risking? In fact, they're happy to call it de-risking again because it makes it easy to justify. And so these are the questions that I'll ask, and I'll stop there just after a couple of ideas. And I'll let Josan really take over about this and give his point of view, passing back to you. But I think that there's definitely need for more clear and comforting statements by the regulators and governments. And I think the statements by Treasury have been explicit, but have not been enough. They need to make sure that they want to protect the legitimate correspondent banking transactions in the system. I think there's a need to have common due diligence databases, standardized databases. Maybe fintechs can help in that. That can be adapted to different types of correspondent banking activities. And again, FATF has also written reports on that. I think there has to be more transparency on the part of correspondent banks on your expectations in terms of cost revenue analysis, on your expectations or the real cost of compliance and how much it's costing you, and what should we generate to you in terms of revenue to justify the relationships. Because otherwise, the cost of compliance will keep skyrocketing and the revenues from correspondent banking will keep shrinking. And there'll be no stop to this de-risking issue going forward. And I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.